It has 650 horsepower. It'll do 0 to 60 in 3.6 seconds, and it does a top speed of 198 miles an hour. Is it the latest Ferrari or Lamborghini? No, it's a Chevy Camaro, and you can buy one for less than a well-equipped pickup truck. Of course, this isn't just any Chevy Camaro. This is a 2017 Chevy Camaro ZL1, and it is the ultimate Chevy Camaro. And yes, it costs less than a well-equipped pickup truck. These things start around $62,000, figure 64, 66, maybe 69 with some options. But with these numbers, you'd expect it to cost 3 times that. And the numbers I said before are true. It'll do basically 200 miles an hour, which is the same as a Lamborghini Huracan. It'll do 0 to 60 in 3.5 seconds, which is the same as a Porsche Carrera GT. And it has 650 horsepower, which is the same as a Ferrari Enzo. And yet, this isn't some European supercar. It's a Camaro built in the Midwest, in a city that has a minor league baseball team called the Lugnuts. So today I've borrowed this ZL1 from a viewer here in New Jersey, and I am going to show you around it. I'm going to show you all of its interesting quirks and cool features. And then I'm going to take it out on the road and tell you what it's like to drive the ultimate Camaro. And then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the ZL1 experience, click the link below to go to autotrader.com/oversteer. To start, I got to talk about the transmission. Now, the ZL1 is offered with a 6-speed manual or a 10-speed automatic. The 10-speed automatic was co-developed with Ford, the arch rival of Chevrolet. And this car has the 10-speed automatic, which is supposedly faster than the stick shift. The 10-speed is also used in a few other Chevy and Ford vehicles, including the new Ford Raptor. Next up, my favorite interior quirk of this car, that would be the climate controls. Now, you wouldn't think climate controls could be interesting, but they are in the new Camaro. Now, if you look at the climate controls, you have all the controls in the middle of the car, just like you'd expect, but how do you change the temperature? There's no button for you to do it. Well, it turns out that the little silver ring around the climate control vents themselves change the temperature. If you move it to the right, it gets warmer, and if you move it to the left, it gets cooler, and the little screens that display the temperature change as you move the little silver rings. I think that's a really cool little Easter egg for making it warmer or cooler inside the Camaro. And speaking of interesting climate controls, another one is the way you adjust the amount of air that comes out. It's kind of cool. It's just a little button you push, just like in every other car, turn it up or down. But what I like is the little tiny orange lights that display exactly how much air is coming out. For some reason, it's a really cool little detail, a little different than every other car. Next up, we got to talk about visibility, which has been a problem in the Camaro since the last generation model came out in 2010. It's one of the drawbacks of sort of the retro design. There's a big pillar here, and so over your shoulder, it can be hard to see out behind you. There are some benefits to this one, though. This car has blind spot monitoring, which does a lot of the work for you. There's a little light in the mirror that turns on, and if you put on your turn signal, the light blinks to let you know, hey, there's someone in your blind spot. Next up, we got to talk about getting in back, and as usual, I will climb in the back to amuse all of you people. The biggest problem that I see is the seatbelt. You can't really get it out of the way, but with the seat all the way forward, it's not that hard to climb in back, and I can put the seat back and I'm okay back here. The legroom is tight here in the back seats, but you expect that. This is a 2-door car, so you kind of figure the legroom is going to be a little tight. And it's really not that bad compared to what I was expecting, but the legroom isn't the biggest problem in back. The real problem with the back seats is the headroom. I'm sitting here right now, and if I sit upright, my head has to go like this. It's incredible. If you look at the top of the back seats, there's only about 4 inches between the headrest and the roof of this car. Basically, anybody who sits back here kind of has to tilt their head. And even though General Motors has provided a generous little cutout for additional headroom, it doesn't really help all that much. One other interesting thing about the back seats, back here in the back seats, between the 2 seats, there's a little pad for wireless charging. Now, there's not a pad like that in the front seats. There's only one in the back seats. Apparently, it's to make backseat passengers feel better about their lack of headroom. One other thing about that wireless charging pad, if you take a look at it, the warning label for how you're supposed to use it points toward the front seats. So they kind of figure it's the front seat passengers who are going to be using it, and the rear seats won't really be occupied that often. Next, moving on to all this car's cool performance tech features and quirks, and there are quite a few, and they're all really interesting. For example, if you have this car in sport or track driving mode, and you put the transmission lever in manual shift mode, the heads-up display in the windshield, that will light up like an old-time drag strip with green, yellow, and red lights that that tell you when it's time to shift, and that is really cool. Speaking of manual mode, another cool thing I found in this car, if you're trying to shift and the engine isn't going fast enough to get the next gear, a little warning light will come on in the gauge cluster that says, "Shift denied." Sorry. Next up is the Performance Data Recorder, or as all the Camaro people call it, the PDR. It was an option in this car. It costs like $1,300 extra, and it is absolutely worth it. And here's why. A lot of cars have this thing where they'll measure your laps and your lap times and your track speeds and all that, but that is nothing compared to what this car has. This car has a built-in dash cam with an SD card, and it records your lap in really high quality, so you can just drive along on the racetrack and have a full record of it. And it gets even better. Not only does it record it, it also prints your speed, your G-forces at the bottom of the screen. It is one of the coolest things I've seen. You can even watch it in playback in the car. And if that wasn't the coolest part of it, then the coolest part would have to be valet mode. Here's how valet mode works. Before you hand the keys to a valet, you go into valet mode in the center touchscreen, and you enter a 4-digit PIN twice to confirm you want the car to go into valet mode. Then it shuts down everything. You can't even turn on the stereo anymore once it's in valet mode. And it automatically records using that dash cam what the valet does with your car. That is the coolest thing in the world. There's no more fears the valet is going to trash your car in the parking garage. And if he does, it'll be on camera. And if that wasn't cool enough, then there's teen driver mode. Same deal for teen driver mode. You go in with a little pin, enter the car into teen driver mode, and then you can monitor what your teen driver did in the car. How do you monitor it if they're driving it? Because the car gives you a report card afterwards. It shows up in the infotainment system, and it actually shows you how many times the teen floored it, how many times they slammed on the brakes and used anti-lock brakes, whether they turned off the traction control. It shows you their maximum speed. And it even shows you whether or not the teen violated the speed limit, because this car shows you the speed limit in the gauge cluster, so it knows how many overspeed incidents your teen driver did. It is one of the coolest things I've seen in a car. It just monitors your teen to a crazy level, but then again, you'd probably want that if you were going to trust them with your Camaro ZL1. Now, another cool thing inside the infotainment system, this car gives you the ability to change the color of the interior lighting. Now, a lot of cars have that. You can change it from blue to red to green, but in this one, you have like 50 options in every color. You want blue? Fine. You want a darker blue? Fine. You want a lighter blue? Fine. You want purple? Fine. Darker purple, white, green, red, it's all there. Or another cool thing you can do with the interior light strips, maybe cooler than actually changing it yourself, you can set them to match the drive mode that you're in. So if you're in normal mode, they light up as blue like they do in a lot of General Motors cars, or if you go into sport or track mode, they get redder and redder as the car gets angrier. And where exactly are these light strips whose colors that you can change? Well, they're actually pretty visible. For example, there's one on the door panel, on both door panels, there's one in the middle in the cup holders, and there's another one right on top of the infotainment screen, right on your line of sight on the dashboard. A couple of other interesting things inside the interior, and specifically in the gauge cluster, there are two notable quirks, one of which is the ability to change the whole car to metric. Now, that's not that unusual, but the thing I like about this car is it doesn't actually change the speedometer, it just changes how the units are displayed. So your former 200-mile-an-hour speedometer, when you change it to metric, it becomes 200 kilometers an hour, so you can only see the car go up to 120 miles an hour, which means theoretically you could have this thing pegged at 200 if you change it to metric. Another interesting thing inside the gauge cluster is it shows you your tire temperature. Now, this isn't that uncommon for performance cars, but the cool thing in this one is it shows it to you by color. So if your tires are cool, it's green, and as they start to heat up, they get yellow and then eventually red. Obviously, it also shows the temperature, but that is a really cool idea, the visualization. A few other interesting things. The steering wheel is lined in Alcantara, which I love. It makes it so much grippier. It's fun to drive around in, and it's better on the track as your hands get sweaty on hot track days. And the interesting thing about the steering wheel is at the bottom it says 50. That's because this is the 50th anniversary of the Camaro, which came out, of course, in 1967. It doesn't say 50 or 50th anywhere else in the car, just in the bottom of the steering wheel, and you wouldn't know what that means unless you know what that means. Another interesting quirk is down here on the door, and that would be the placement of the trunk opener button. Now, it looks like it's just randomly strewn in the middle of the door panel, but it isn't really all that random. It's actually there for a reason. When you're opening the door, you can put your hand here to open the door, and then with one motion, you can open up the trunk, press the trunk button. That is smart thinking from Chevrolet. And that leads us to the trunk. Now, you can open it on the door panel like I just showed you, or there's a little button on the key fob that you can use to open it, or you can open it down here with a little button right above the license plate that I bet many Camaro owners don't even know is there. You press it, the trunk pops open. Now, the interesting thing about the trunk in this car is it's surprisingly large, except because federal regulations prevent Chevrolet from putting the taillights on the trunk itself, they have to stay put, and that means the trunk opening is pretty small. Now the weird thing here is the trunk is larger than the opening. So there's some stuff that you could probably fit inside the trunk that you can't actually get in the trunk because the opening is relatively small. Interestingly, this car does have folding rear seats in the back, so you can fold them down to get even more stuff in the trunk, assuming that you can get it in the opening. And since I'm outside this car, it's time to talk about the engine. Now, like I mentioned before, this thing has 650 horsepower, and that comes courtesy of a 6.2 liter supercharged V8. It's the same engine that they use in the Corvette Z06, which is a very serious car on its own. Now, there are a couple of other interesting things up front, in addition to the engine, one of which is the big carbon fiber piece on the hood that says ZL1 on either side. Now, that isn't just there for show. If you look, it goes into the hood. It actually sort of curves downward, and inside the hood you can see that there are some heat extractors. The whole point is it brings in cold air and then it does what it needs to, and then it gets rid of the hot air, so that isn't just cosmetic. Now, the other interesting thing in front of the ZL1, you can clearly tell that you aren't looking at just a regular Camaro if you simply glance at the front end. This car has a really aggressive front end design with all sorts of holes to allow in as much air as possible. The coolest thing, I think, is that even the Chevy emblem on the front is hollow to allow more air in. Now, Chevy's badge is typically called the bow tie, and so when it's hollow like this in this car, they call it the flow tie. But despite the stupid name, Chevy says the flow tie is actually functional. It allows an additional 3 cubic meters of air per minute into the engine, and it lowers the temperatures by 2 degrees. So I'm fine with the flow tie then. And then, of course, there's the ZL1's exhaust note, which sounds nice and aggressive. Take a listen. The interesting quirks and the cool features of the Camaro ZL1, and now it's time to get out on the road in this thing. In a Camaro with more horsepower than a McLaren 650S. In a Camaro with a higher top speed than a Porsche 911 GT3 RS. All right. I put it in track mode and the steering is considerably heavy. Like, it's crazy. You can feel it instantly. So if I put it back in Tour, oh, it lightens up so much. I don't know that I've ever driven a car where the steering was so obviously different between both. The first thing you notice when you climb in this car is the sound. I mean, just turning it on just to like shoot the little things around the car, the little, you know, the infotainment system on. Every time I turn on, you almost start laughing because the exhaust is so good. Downshifts are so good. They're also really quick. Somebody's gonna call the cops in about 3 seconds. Boy, I love the sound. It really sounds like an old-time muscle car. It sounds like a muscle car should sound, but it's a lot faster. How is that? Oh my God. Wow. Oh, the steering is so tight in this track mode. Wow. This car is, there's nobody who owns one of these who's not going to get pulled over, except for the people who keep them in their garages. It just goads you to go faster because the sound is so amazing when you're going really fast, and obviously it gives you the thrill of getting kicked back in your seat, but then also it does all this performance stuff, like it shows you your G-forces and it lets you measure your 0 to 60 time and blah, blah, blah. It's one of these cars that is begging you to abuse it. The owner tells me not that many people notice it, but some people notice it. Car people notice it. It is the cool, hot, new Camaro. So someone like a pickup or, you know, a Jeep or whatever, they're not going to notice. But car people notice. And when I was filming with it, a guy in a red Charger came up and he got really excited. Oh, it's the ZL1. You know, at low speeds, this car is actually pretty docile. Like it's not like you're stopped at a light and it's like old muscle cars, like it's like rumbling, you know, like you can feel everything rumbling. The big problem with the Camaro and the Charger and the Challenger and all these cars is the belt line is real high. It makes the car look cool, but it sacrifices visibility and it makes you kind of feel like you're like riding in a bathtub almost, like you're sitting and all the walls are up around you. It's a downshift into first gear at like 30. Oh, just sounds so good. You know, it feels like a bigger car on this road, and there's no doubt, I mean, it is a bigger car, but it also barely body rolls. It's not an S2000 or Miata or something like that, but you can, with brute force, you can throw your way through these corners. If you're used to driving a Miata or a Boxster or something like that, you'll find this car to be large, but it handles it very, very well. All these cars, the GT350R, they just do such a great job minimizing the impact of their size. You know, we know this car's track performance, we know what it's done. Like, this is the full package. People are gonna talk badly about Camaro forever, you know, it's still got that sort of redneck image. And that's just what it is, but they've now, General Motors doesn't screw around anymore. They're not just throwing big motors in cars they haven't put a lot of engineering into. This is a serious car, and it's really well done, and you can tell the moment you take it out on the road. So that's the Camaro ZL1. Wow, I've heard this thing is fast, I've read all the numbers, and yet it still astonished me. And this isn't just a Camaro with a big engine. This is a full package with serious power and serious performance. I get the Camaro stigma, and while it may not be an M4 or a Porsche, if you can get past the fact that this is just a Chevy or only a Camaro, it's also a really good sports car with some serious performance. And now it's time to give it a Doug score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the ZL1 is nice enough, but the latest Camaro isn't necessarily beautiful, more blocky and retro, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Next up is acceleration. The ZL1 does 0 to 60 in 3.4 seconds, and it's hard to believe, but that means a Camaro gets a 9 out of 10. Handling is good, but it's not really that nimble. I really think a lot of the reason this car manages to go so quickly around corners is in part due to brute force and massive power. Still, it handles well with minimal body roll and good steering, and it gets a 7 out of 10. The cool factor is strong. This will probably subside as newer versions come out, but right now this car is hot, and it gets a 7 out of 10. And then there's importance. This car is certainly above average, but it's not exactly a Ferrari or a limited production exotic, so it gets a 6 out of 10. That brings the weekend score to 35 out of 50, placing it right next to some serious cars. Moving on to the daily categories, starting with equipment, the ZL1 is loaded. It even has ventilated seats, and it's only missing some of the top safety tech, which most ZL1 owners probably don't care about anyway, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Comfort is fine. It's not overly comfortable or especially punishing, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Quality is surprisingly good, especially for a Camaro. This is a legitimately nice place to spend time, and while it's no Mercedes, it's miles ahead of the 4th gen Camaro I remember when I was growing up, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Practicality, it has 11.3 cubic feet of cargo space, which allows it to just squeeze into a 4 out of 10, much like you'll have to just squeeze things into its tiny trunk opening. And finally, there's value. These are easy to find in the $65,000 to $75,000 range, and they aren't being marked up much. They offer supercar performance for a third of the cost, and it's an easy 8 out of 10, bringing the total daily score to a 30 out of 50, placing it surprisingly high on the list. Added up, and the total Doug score is 65 out of 100, which is reasonably high, but no surprise, as the ZL1 is a good value, well equipped, and of course it offers excellent performance. But we aren't done yet. I've already filmed a video of the ZL1's rival, the Shelby GT350R, and I know you want to know which is better, so I decided to Doug score that car too, and the comparison is right here. You'll notice the ZL1 beats out the GT350R by 1 total point, but you'll also notice the ZL1 wins the value category by 2 points, largely because everyone is marking up GT350Rs like crazy. The average asking price on AutoTrader right now is still more than $87,000. If the GT350R comes down in price, it would win this comparison. The ZL1 has a better interior and it's faster, but the GT350R has some of the best steering and handling of any car I've driven, and I happen to think it's just a little better looking. These are both wonderful cars, but I personally would take the Mustang, and that $87,000 asking price suggests the market agrees with me.